$1 billion platform sits in the middle of nowhere, and 200 men run it around the clock. The rooms they sleep in are smaller than a prison cell, but nobody ever said anything. So why did that silence last as long as it did? FPSOs and deep-water drilling units cost over $1 billion. Dynamic positioning, blowout preventers, subsea control systems, a power plant, a hospital, a helipad. Every deck meter accounted for. Except the square footage given to the men keeping all of it alive. Nobody was paying attention to offshore accommodation standards back then. The regulatory frameworks were built around operational safety, blowout prevention, fire suppression, emergency evacuation, not around whether a man could stand upright in the room where he slept. That was about to change. Start with a number: 70 square feet. That is the minimum standard set by the California Board of Corrections for a single prison cell. A convicted criminal is legally entitled to 70 square feet because researchers and institutional designers spent decades establishing that below a certain threshold, confinement causes measurable psychological and physiological harm. 70 square feet is not generous. It is the floor. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. Documented offshore bunk rooms on working platforms frequently fall below that threshold, and they are not single occupancy. Multiple men share these spaces. Bunk frames are stacked so tightly that the ceiling sits roughly 18 inches from your face when you lie down. Not comfortable headroom. Painted steel, vibrating faintly with machinery 2 decks below. You cannot sit up. You roll onto your side and stare at the underside of the bunk above you. And that is your world for however many hours you were allocated before the next shift. There is no window. Natural light is a concept that exists somewhere above you, on the deck. Temperature is controlled by a central system you have no influence over. Ventilation runs on the platform schedule, not yours. Personal storage is a locker roughly the size of a carry-on suitcase. Your clothes, your toiletries, whatever small objects you brought to remind yourself that home exists. Everything else gets checked at the helipad when you land. The sardonic observation that experienced hands make about these rooms is always the same sentiment repeated without variation. At least the prison cell is yours alone. The men who signed those contracts would look back on this moment and wish they had made a different call. Not because the money wasn't real, because nobody told them what the room would actually cost them. Every man who has done multiple rotations knows this arithmetic. They have done it in their heads at 3 in the morning, lying in the dark 18 inches below someone else's mattress. The number always comes out the same. Picture the end of a 12-hour shift on a working offshore platform. Not the end of a desk shift, the end of 12 hours on deck, in weather, operating machinery worth hundreds of millions of dollars, where a single moment of inattention can trigger a catastrophe that kills people. The offshore standard rotation is 12 hours on, 12 hours off, for 28 consecutive days. No weekends, no variation, no recovery days. The calendar does not acknowledge fatigue. The platform does not slow down because a crew has been running for 3 weeks straight. Noise levels on the working deck routinely exceed 85 decibels, the sustained sound level of standing next to a running lawnmower. Offshore workers wear hearing protection for 12 hours. Then, they take it off and walk inside. The physical demands are not abstract. Heavy lifting, equipment operation in high wind and salt spray, exposure to extreme heat near processing equipment, and extreme cold in open ocean weather. The body absorbs all of it every single day for 4 weeks, with no rest days to offset the accumulating physical stress. The cognitive load is the part that rarely gets discussed. Operating dynamic positioning systems, monitoring well pressure, managing blowout preventer status, these tasks do not forgive distraction. The margin for error on a deep-water drilling unit is effectively 0. You carry that weight for 12 hours. Then the shift ends, and you walk directly into a room smaller than a prison cell to recover. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal sequence of events, repeated every single day, for 28 days, every rotation, for the length of a career that might span a decade or more. If that sounds bad, keep watching. Imagine trying to sleep inside a running engine. Not next to one, inside one. That is the closest approximation to what offshore rest actually involves, because the platform never stops. The generators run continuously.
The drilling equipment transmits vibration through the steel frame, through the deck plating, through the walls of the accommodation module, and directly into the bunk frame you are lying on. The hum is not background noise. It is contact. It is physical. Sharon Dolovich's research framework on institutional confinement identifies a specific cluster of environmental factors that reliably produce chronic sleep deprivation. Cramped sleeping surfaces, persistent ambient noise, absence of light control, and inability to regulate temperature. Offshore bunk rooms check every single box on that list simultaneously. The rotating shift structure compounds the problem. On a platform running 2 crews on 12-hour rotations, half the bunk room is always trying to sleep, while the other half is preparing to move, opening lockers, moving through the corridor. There is no quiet period. Someone is always coming or going. Chronic sleep deprivation, sustained inadequate sleep over days and weeks, is associated with measurable cardiovascular damage, impaired cognitive function, elevated inflammatory markers, and sharply increased accident risk. On a platform where one operational error can trigger a blowout or a structural failure capable of killing dozens of people, the men making critical decisions are running on sleep the environment has systematically degraded. The industry tracks safety incidents. It tracks near misses. What it does not prominently track is the cumulative sleep deficit of the crew operating the equipment. The connection between those two data sets is not a mystery. It is just inconvenient. 200 men on a platform. 200 people within the same 500-meter radius, 24 hours a day for 28 days. By any conventional measure, you are never alone. And yet, the psychological experience that long rotation offshore workers consistently describe is a specific, suffocating form of loneliness. The kind that comes not from absence of people, but from absence of space. Personal space is functionally zero. Every activity happens within the same compressed geography. You eat in the galley. You work on the deck. You sleep in the bunk room. There is no room to close a door and be genuinely alone. The ocean is everywhere around you, infinite, open, unreachable, and you cannot access any of it. Institutional design research is consistent on this point. Crowding combined with insufficient personal space produces measurable increases in interpersonal conflict, elevated cortisol levels, and progressive deterioration of mental health outcomes. These are documented physiological responses to spatial confinement replicated across naval vessels, research stations, and correctional facilities. The men on the platform celebrated their first paychecks. They shouldn't have. Because around week 3, something shifts. Experienced offshore workers describe it in almost identical terms regardless of where they worked. The walls start to feel closer. The same faces in the same galley begin to generate a low-grade friction that wasn't there in week 1. The psychological buffer a person normally maintains through private space has been fully depleted. And there are still days left in the rotation. The ocean is right there. You can see it from the deck. You cannot reach it. The galley is not just a place to eat. On an offshore platform, the mess hall is the closest thing to a town square that exists within 500 meters of ocean in every direction. The galley is where shift transitions happen, where informal briefings occur, where the social architecture of the platform gets built meal by meal, rotation by rotation. Shared meals are treated as something close to sacred. When every other form of personal space has been compressed to nothing, the communal table becomes the one place where the pressure releases slightly. You sit down, you eat, you talk about something that is not the job. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry, and offshore workers have turned that math into an art form, finding the joke in every impossible situation, because the alternative is sitting with it alone. Dark humor is the unofficial language of offshore survival. The worse the conditions, the sharper the jokes. This is not denial. It is a documented coping mechanism.
the conversion of genuine threat into shared absurdity, distributing psychological weight across the group instead of leaving it concentrated in any one person. Informal mentorship runs through every crew. Experienced hands quietly absorb newer crew members still figuring out how to manage the mental grind. Not through formal programs.
Through sitting next to someone who looks like they are struggling, explaining that week 3 is always the hardest and that it passes. Passing on the rituals that make the time manageable. These rituals are not trivial. They are load-bearing. The bond that forms in confinement between men who share the same compressed space, the same noise, the same risk, the same distance from home, is unlike anything that forms on land. The crew had 28 days before the rotation ended and the helicopter came, and the clock had already started. The real question is what happened behind closed doors. Specifically, the design meetings where offshore accommodation modules were specified, costed, and approved. Because the spatial outcome was not an accident. It was a calculation. Every square meter of living space on an offshore platform is a square meter not generating revenue. Platform operators pay day rates that can exceed $500,000 per day for a deepwater drilling unit. Accommodation modules are prefabricated onshore and installed to minimum regulatory compliance, not to any standard derived from human comfort research, not to any benchmark set by occupational health science. The regulatory frameworks governing offshore accommodation were largely written in an era when the primary concern was whether the platform would sink or explode. Habitability standards were secondary at best. The BSCC Jail Design Guide, which sets spatial standards for convicted criminals held in county jails in California, mandates higher per-person square footage and more rigorous environmental controls than most offshore operators are legally required to provide for their workers. Read that again. The standard for housing a convicted criminal is more protective of their spatial needs than the standard applied to a skilled industrial worker who chose the job and is being paid to do it. Companies operating offshore are not, in most cases, breaking the law. They are operating within the legal limits that apply to their jurisdiction and vessel registration. The limits themselves are the problem. The floor was set low, and the industry built to the floor because building above it costs money, and the regulatory environment never demanded otherwise. The system is not broken. It is working exactly as designed. That is the part that should make you uncomfortable. Place 2 floor plans side by side. The first is a single occupancy prison cell, minimum 70 square feet, mandated by institutional design law, required to include a sleeping surface, sanitation access, and adequate ventilation. The second is a documented offshore bunk room, sub 70 square feet, multiple occupants, no legally enforced minimum spatial standard, no natural light requirement, no independent temperature control mandate. These are not hypothetical comparisons. They are documented realities drawn from institutional design guidelines and offshore accommodation inspection records. The numbers exist. The floor plans exist. The comparison is available to anyone willing to place them next to each other, which almost nobody in the industry does publicly. The historical context makes the comparison sharper. Archaic American prison cells, the ones condemned by federal courts and described in judicial opinions as constitutionally inhumane, were documented at between 28 and 45 square feet. Courts found that spatial compression at that level constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. The language in those decisions is specific. Confinement at that density degrades human dignity, impairs psychological function, and constitutes punishment beyond what the sentence itself requires. Offshore bunk rooms in the same size range exist right now, on operating platforms, occupied by men who are not serving sentences. They are earning wages. They volunteered, and because they volunteered, the conversation stops there. The legal architecture that protects a convicted criminal's right to 70 square feet does not extend to a roughneck sleeping in 45. Because the roughneck signed a contract and can, theoretically, choose to leave. The question is not whether the arrangement is legal. It is. The question is whether voluntary entry into a confined space makes the confinement itself acceptable. Whether the presence of a paycheck changes what the spatial compression does to a human body and a human mind. You are lying 18 inches below someone else's mattress. You have been doing it for 23 days straight, and the contract you signed is the reason nobody is required to give you more room. The research on that question is not ambiguous. The industry's engagement with that research has been. A man who has spent 10 years working offshore rotations carries something that does not show up on a medical chart in any obvious way. It accumulates slowly, the way debt accumulates, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in the compound interest of 1,000 small deficits, stacking rotation after rotation, year after year. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Now, the body could have stopped there. It didn't. Cardiovascular research on offshore and shift-working populations consistently documents elevated rates of hypertension and heart disease relative to comparable onshore workers. The mechanism is well established. Chronic sleep disruption elevates cortisol and inflammatory markers, which over years translate into measurable cardiovascular damage. The 12-hour shift and the noise in the bunk room are not separate stressors. They are a system, and the system runs continuously for the length of a career. Cognitive decline follows a similar trajectory. Years of disrupted sleep cycles degrade the brain's capacity for executive function. The decision-making, risk assessment, and situational awareness that offshore work demands at the highest level. The longer a man works in this environment, the more the environment degrades the very capacities his job requires him to maintain. Mental health outcomes in long rotation offshore crews show elevated rates of anxiety and clinical depression relative to general population baselines. The isolation, the spatial compression, the disrupted sleep, the sustained separation from family. These factors do not operate independently. They interact and amplify each other across the length of a rotation and across the length of a career. Men who have spent a decade offshore describe a specific disorientation on returning home. They call it feeling institutionalized. The open space of a house feels wrong. The silence feels wrong. The body is calibrated to confinement, and recalibrating takes longer each time. Everything these men had built, their tolerance, their adaptation, their survival mechanisms, was about to work against them. The industry knows exactly what it has built. Day rates exceed $500,000. The accommodation budget does not move. And the men who understand the math better than anyone keep boarding the helicopter anyway, because the number on the paycheck is the only number in this equation that was ever designed to grow. Until the industry is forced to reckon with its own spatial math, these men will keep surviving, because surviving is what they do. Subscribe for more.